On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The United States military is doing a fantastic job.
America's war in Afghanistan will come to a responsible end.
It's nice to know that you're fighting for something that is doing well as opposed to something that was not doing well just a number of years ago.
Welcome to Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Yes, it's been almost 20 years, and on Sunday, the United States signed what's called a truce with the Taliban in Doha, but without the Afghan government involved. That's seemingly at the request of the Taliban. Is this really a step forward to bring an end to a war which has lasted almost 20 years? Part of the accord was the agreement calling for the release of Taliban and Afghan government prisoners of war. But Afghan President Ashraf Ghani said no. And not long after, the Taliban attacked. And then after the signing of the truce, U.S. troops and Afghan government forces attacked again, as if the truce was never signed, claiming the lives of over 16 people. And this all happened over the course of the last few days. President Trump seems to be going after American public opinion that there's going to be a retreat from Afghanistan. And as we can hear in his most recent Make America Great rally, he said this.
2 days ago, the United States signed a deal with the Taliban so that after 19 years of conflict, and very close to 20, we can finally begin to bring our amazing troops back home. After years of rebuilding foreign nations, we are finally rebuilding our nation and taking care of our own American citizens. And all of the things that we've done, we've wiped out terrorists, we've done so much. And you know what? We're 8,000 miles away. You got a lot of big countries surrounding Afghanistan. You've got Afghanistan itself.
And Trump also spoke with a Taliban leader, who he thought was the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, saying, as he would often say, we actually had a very good talk with the leader of the Taliban. Well, the madness of this war must end. The question is how, and will this do it? Retired U.S. Army Major Danny Surgeon wrote an article called Happy Afghanistan Surrender Day for Truthdig a few days ago. He served both in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's now an author, speaker, podcaster, and activist. His latest book coming up is Patriotic Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War, and joins us once again. Welcome back, Danny. Good to have you.
Oh, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Mine too. So here we have the Taliban refusing to negotiate with the Afghan government. The president saying the Afghan president is a puppet. I think it's more complex than that. Trump accepted this and negotiated on their behalf, but there were no representatives there. And so, the question is, where does this really lead? Does this really lead to an end to a war? I mean, is the Afghan government really not part of this? How do you see this unfolding?
Well, it's really hard to predict how this unfolds. I will say that, in principle, conceptually, I agree with the president's idea that it is time to go, that withdrawal has been long appropriate, right? We should have probably withdrawn long ago. What's unclear is the sincerity of the American position, how long this will hold, if at all. And then there's also this gap, this interesting dynamic where for the longest time, right, 2 presidential administrations, 16 years, the United States said, listen, Taliban, if you want to negotiate, you got to negotiate with the sovereign government in Kabul, that we helped install. And the Taliban said, no, we won't deal with them. Well, in 2018, there was a major pivot in American policy under Trump where we said, okay, we will have a bilateral negotiation with the Taliban. And this is sort of the output of that, or the initial output of that. But I think what's lost is realizing, I was purposely being flippant when I say Afghan Surrender Day. I don't think it's all that simple.
Right.
All right. But I think that this 2018 moment when we said we will talk just to the Taliban and basically cut out the Afghan government, that was the moment really where the United States first accepted, I would argue, some version of defeat. Just accepted that we had not achieved our goals and something new had to be tried. I actually support that in principle. I do so cautiously and understanding that there are limitations in, maybe sincerity or practicality, and also there's, there are going to be victims on the Afghan side that I'm concerned about as well.
Well, let me pick up on that point. Before we get, I'm going to jump after this to George Bush and talking about what he said many years ago and where this leaves us today. But what you just said, I mean, some people look at the Afghan government as a total puppet of the United States. I think it's much more nuanced than that. And I think Ashraf Ghani saying, no, I'm not going to participate in this is part of that. But they are a weak government. They're in some of the urban areas. They don't control a great deal of their own country. But the question becomes, if the United States goes into a country like Afghanistan, like Iraq, tears it asunder, what is our responsibility after that to the people that we leave behind? By that I mean the women I've interviewed, as we talked on the air. I talked to a number of women from the Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women, RAWA, over the years. And one of their questions is, so you're going to leave us to be Burkerized all over again? And not that they support the U.S. invasion, but there's a complexity to this. It's like Vietnam. We left tons of people behind in Vietnam, or the Iraqi interpreters you left behind. So, I think those questions, even if you oppose these wars as imperialistic interventions, it shouldn't happen. What about that aspect of it?
I mean, I'm of two minds about this, and I call it head and heart, right? So, heart says, I'm for female education, right? I'm for secular values in government, and I'm not for beheading, right? So certainly I find the Taliban oftentimes to be abhorrent. I am concerned for those who worked with us, just like I was in Iraq. Now, the question is, here's where the head comes in.
Right.
Are we going to get caught in a trap? And what I mean is, there is a sunken cost trap where you say, well, we can't leave because too many people have worked with us who will now be at risk. We can't leave because if we leave, then, the women in Kabul would be at risk if the Taliban takes over. But the problem with that is, just logically, it's a formula for potentially forever war, since we have not shown the capacity to win, right? Because we're in a worse position militarily than we have been ever in the war, just empirically, right? Provincial control. And then the second thing that sort of comes from that is the question, do we even possess the capability to meaningfully alter the ultimate outcome in Afghanistan? I would submit no, and that whether we leave today or 10 years from now, the general outcome is probably the same. So what can we do? Well, it's very limited, besides economic aid and actually opening our borders to these folks who did work for us, or to political refugees. Short of doing that, there's not a whole lot we can do. But what's interesting is we're dealing with a government, and it's not just Trump. I mean, there were immigration problems before him, but we're dealing with an administration or a U.S. government that will, destroy these societies or contribute to destroying these societies, and then close our borders to the very same folks if they're vaguely brown and or Muslim. And it's just the cynicism of that. I think it's ultimately counterproductive in the region. It makes us look bad. But I don't want to get caught up in the women's rights or the education trap where we stay forever. When I still don't think I don't think we can achieve much more than holding the major cities, especially with just 14,000 soldiers.
And I agree. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, I really don't think that we have. I think we overestimate America's ability in the world in general, but especially in Afghanistan, to meaningfully alter things. Or just matters on the ground. The agency really tends to belong to the Taliban and to a lesser extent the Afghan government. You want a prediction? Historical prediction? Najibullah, who was the communist leader of Afghanistan, who the Russians had sort of helped keep in power, when they left in 1988, everyone expected that he would fall right away to the Mujahideen, which some of whom became the Taliban. He actually held on for, I believe, like 4 years.
Right.
With some Russian military aid and economic aid, and also because there were people who legitimately believed in communism and reform and sort of modernization of, gender relations in Afghanistan. He held on for about 4 years. Of course, he's eventually hung after he hides out in an embassy. My prediction is that I don't think the Taliban is going to take over tomorrow, but we're going to see probably some version of another short, bloody civil war. And I wouldn't be too surprised if the government in Kabul goes the way of Najibullah, unfortunately.
I think you're not far wrong. I think actually you're right, not far wrong. I think you're right about what could happen after this. And, if you look at it historically, whether it's the British or whether in the 19th century or whether it's the Russians or whether it's us in this century, no one has ever been able to handle Afghanistan. I mean, you battle the Pashtuns at your own risk. And that's always been the historical case. Look at this. This is what George Bush had to say in 2010. I really want to play this for a moment to grapple with something.
I said a long time ago, one of our objectives is to smoke them out and get them running and bring them to justice. We're smoking them out. They're running. And now we're going to bring them to justice. I also said we'll use whatever means is necessary to achieve that objective. And that's exactly what we're going to do. The American people must understand that we've got a long way to go in order to achieve our objective in this theater. But we're patient, we're resolved, and we will stay the course until we achieve our objective.
So, as you and I both know, this war was BS from the very beginning. It made no sense, the way this war was fought. And as I think I told you in an email earlier, as we were preparing for this program, I interviewed Karzai just after he was dropped off in a cave in Afghanistan at the very beginning. It was insane from that moment on. So I'm curious. You wrote really eloquently in your piece about the soldiers, the men under your command, the officers who fought with you, and what their responses were to this, even though they were further to the right. So talk a bit about that. I mean, what does this say to us in America and the men and women who fought there, and the men and women, the Afghan men who were killed in this process, and just where we are now? I mean, how does that fit into the definition of this moment?
Bush's speech that you played is just like an exercise in simplification, right? I mean, we're going to smoke them out, right? All this kind of language, it just simplifies it into a morality tale, right? A dichotomy, a Manichaean sort of thing. But actually, it's really complex. And it's a great American and a great Afghan tragedy. For the Afghans, it's a tragedy that really starts in 1973. For the United States, it's a tragedy that, at least for our soldiers, starts in 2001. So on Sunday, the day that the news breaks of this, truce or deal, I was just being a dad at a basketball tournament, and on a whole other subject, on another research topic, I reached out via text, a mass text, to the 9 lieutenants who work for me in Afghanistan, and I made a joke, "Happy Afghan Surrender Day," which became the title of my article that I wrote hours later. And it was remarkable that this group of guys who ranged from maybe one center-left guy to mostly moderate Republicans and a lot of libertarians, they were all in favor, in conceptually, of withdrawing from Afghanistan to a man, and they're all men, to a man, which I thought was, pretty remarkable, 19 years into the war, because these are combat guys, most of whom have lost soldiers there. So one might expect that they would see this deal as a betrayal, right, as a bad surrender. And I got some flippant jokes, responses, but all of them were of the vein that, look, whether I like Trump or I don't, we got to go. And, maybe we're not so sure that this deal is going to hold, but in principle, we support it. And so I think that does speak to where we're at in this great American and also mainly Afghan tragedy, is that the simplicity, the duality of good and evil that Bush laid down in practice, it's just proven to be a mess. And I hope that that's the lesson. I fear we won't, but I hope that that's the lesson moving forward that's taken from this history, because something good, I have to believe something good comes of this war on terror absurdity. I'm not so sure, but I think that the polls that show that more veterans are against the war in Afghanistan than civilians is a very instructive, rare, and unique moment in American history.
So let me kind of conclude with this idea here. One of the things that just came out in the last day was that Fatou Bensouda, who is the head of the International Criminal Court, said there will be an investigation about war crimes against the U.S. and the Taliban in Afghanistan. How does it, do you think this feeds into that at all? I mean, and what's your response to that as someone who served?
There are people within the military who distrust international institutions. And of course, like the ICC, right? Like the United Nations. If you want to hear people bash, international organizations, a good place to find that is in the military, particularly even in the officer ranks. But this is an American phenomenon. And it's not just a Trump thing, this distrust, this unwillingness to play by international norms, many of which were initially founded under like our auspices in the aftermath of World War II. But the problem was that once organizations like the ICC and the United Nations started to be critical of American imperial policy, then we threw our hands up and said, we are not playing. And so I support a full investigation. I'm all about the truth. I believe that there is such a thing as like universal human rights. But you know what's interesting about all of this is I think that it's great that the ICC is looking at all three parties because I believe the Afghan government is also under
Yes,
investigation,
they are. I meant to
as
mention
they
that.
should be.
Yes.
As someone who has witnessed war crimes by Afghan soldiers, okay, I think that all parties should be involved. But you know, one thing to remember is that legislation was passed not too long ago by like the US Congress that basically said that we will go as far as up to military force to invade The Hague if necessary to take an American soldier or an American citizen who is being held there. Like we are so far along the road. This is a true thing that we are not willing to subject our citizens or our soldiers to the same laws that apply to the rest of the world. Now, one might look at that and say, "Hey, we're not going to get a fair trial, or we're exceptional, we're great." But here's the thing: how do you think that plays on the Arab street, on the Afghan street, or anywhere in the world? It plays as American hypocrisy, and it builds anti-American sentiment, or as we like to simplify, it grows terrorists. And so I think that America's refusal to play ball, refusal to accept even an investigation for the most part into itself is it's ultimately counterproductive. And oh, by the way, unethical.
And I guess we can close with this. I mean, it makes me think of what you said a little bit ago, which is what have we learned? You know, when you think about what happened in Vietnam and now Afghanistan and Iraq, we have not learned very much. And now, as you're describing now, it's in a sense gotten worse in terms of what our inability is to even be part of the international dialogue to create a more humane world. So, I mean, I think this is a very telling and also very trying and in many ways frightening moment.
Absolutely. Look, the United States is an imperial entity, and in history they are defined by three things: triumphalism, chauvinism, you know, and then the thing is to keep in mind, this is not going to play well in the world, right? It just exceptionalism, triumphalism, chauvinism. This does not uh, please the people that we're trying to get on our side, and I fear that we are going to miss out on the lessons of this, just like we did in Vietnam. And who knows where the next theater of American war on a concept will be.
Daniel Sir Jensen, thank you so much once again for joining us. Look forward to reading more of your work and having you back again with us soon.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Mark. Talk soon.
You too. Take care. And I'm Mark Steiner here for the Real News Network. Thank you for joining us. Let us know what you think, what you want to know about. Take care.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.